Thank you for calling your Walmart pharmacy. To request a refill, press 1. Please enter the prescription number located on the upper left-hand side of the prescription label.
Imagine dragging yourself to the doctor, feeling awful. Maybe that injury from high school is on fire, or perhaps you fell down yesterday and hurt yourself. You sit through the consultation, your doctor examines you and decides that you need to be put on some sort of medication, and then writes you a prescription. In the United States, you probably have to drive somewhere else to pick that prescription up, so you head to your local pharmacy. You wait in line, and when it's your turn, you hand the pharmacist your prescription. She looks down at it, then back up at you, and hands it back, coldly saying, "We don't fill that drug, not for people like you." You're caught off guard. "What do you mean, people like me?" She explains, "We only provide opioid prescriptions to chronic pain patients, and you have to bring your doctor with you to pick up the drugs. Plus, we need special permission from your insurance company. Oh, and you have to take a class about overdose prevention. Sorry." As she hands you back your prescription, you realize that you don't know where else to get your drugs. I mean, maybe you can try another pharmacy, but shit, if this one just shamed you and turned you away, what are the chances that you're wasting your time going somewhere else? If you're gonna have to beg for your medication and be judged by pharmacists who don't want to fill them, maybe you should just go to the streets. Drug dealers never shame their customers. This scenario isn't real. Not yet, anyway. But apparently, this is what the Department of Justice is trying to make happen. And some of us are pissed off. It's so obvious that it's hard to miss, but they're doing it anyway. They're trying to force big suppliers of controlled substances to tighten up dispensing regulations. And that means they're trying to force people to the streets for their drugs. And with that new demand for street drugs will come new suppliers, dealers who can then be arrested and blamed for overdose deaths. This is the same recipe we've seen over and over. And once you're arrested for selling drugs in the United States, your cash, your possessions, your house sometimes, all of these things become the property of the police who arrested you, who can then auction it off to pay for department operations. It's a fucked up system, one that almost guarantees corruption and overzealous police officers looking to pay their own salaries by busting people with drugs instead of solving real crimes. Assault arrests don't put a dime in the department's bank account, but a single drug arrest can net tens of thousands of dollars in the coffers of local police departments.
Yeah, see, like our $118,000 I pulled over right here and we caught the rest of the guy. $25,000 I got out of that seizure. That's what we bought this car for.
This episode is about the newest chapter in the war on drugs, which is no different than the last chapter, or the one before that. The Warriors realized a long time ago that this war only works if it keeps ramping up, expanding, soaking up more and more resources, every year, forever. That means it has to keep failing, and we don't have a problem there. Drugs are far more common now than they were shortly after the war on drugs began 100 years ago. And they're far more dangerous, not to mention more expensive. The politicians and police officers in charge of waging the war, they know this. But if they admit it, or if goodness me, they start making policies based off it, well then they'll have to let some of their well-paid warriors go. They'll have to lay them off, and that's no fun. We can't fire cops. But eventually the warriors hit a wall in their permanent expansion. They're already arresting everyone they find. Yet more people died of drug overdoses last year than the year before, or in any year in the history of this country. 79,000 between May of 2019 and May of 2020. That's according to the latest tally by the CDC. And we survivors are angry, so we complain to the only people we know to complain to, law enforcement, whom we've been told are all superheroes above reproach. The phone calls prosecutors and sheriffs are fielding from mourning family members and infuriated friends, well, they give them permission to do the only things they know how to do, ramp up the war yet further. They have to blame somebody, and they aren't going to blame themselves. The war can't keep expanding unless it seeks out new and updated targets. And that's what this episode is about. The latest target, pharmacies, and specifically, strategically, Walmart pharmacies. give you a quick overview, the Department of Justice claims that Walmart violated the law on two fronts. Number one, they didn't properly screen to make sure people really needed the opioid prescriptions that they were filling. And number two, they failed to detect and report suspicious prescriptions to the government, to the police. They didn't snoop into customers' personal business, and they didn't snitch to law enforcement when they saw something that might have been suspicious. I mean, this is some Big Brother shit. On the first point, that they didn't properly screen those with prescriptions to make sure they were legit, the government's basically telling Walmart that if they want to avoid this in the future, even if they win this particular case, that they should question why patients are prescribed certain drugs, or maybe asked to examine the injury. I mean, I don't know how they expect Walmart pharmacists to do this, but certainly not without being intrusive and possibly violating privacy laws. But again, they don't care. The point is to make Walmart hesitate to fill opioid prescriptions, thereby sending users to the streets for unsafe drugs. It's no secret that we don't just stop using painkillers when our prescriptions are cut off. And then they can arrest the new dealers that show up and confiscate their property to fund police department operations. That is, unless the government expects us to believe that after 100 years of fighting this war, the one thing they never tried was eliminating clean, safe drug supplies from pharmacies. This is bullshit, plain and simple, and it's a great example of how the war on drugs is not meant to protect anyone. The government doesn't care if your kid overdoses or catches hepatitis. They care about employing more warriors every year to fight a war that they already know can't be won. Land of the free, right? But the second requirement is even worse. The Department of Justice is saying that Walmart should not only refuse to fill legitimate prescriptions if certain pharmacists feel like they're fishy, but also that they should call the cops and report you and your doctor for even trying to fill it in the first place. Again, the goal here is clearly not harm reduction. The goal is to scare doctors and pharmacists into telling people who need drugs that they can't have them, not legally anyway, and to scare patients into avoiding the pharmacy altogether. And when our doctors won't help us, we either live in pain or we head to the streets. You might remember that the makers of Oxycontin and some other painkillers, Purdue, was sued last year for advertisement practices which the government claimed fueled the so-called opioid crisis, a crisis which could be halted tomorrow by simply legalizing and regulating drugs, by sending users to doctors instead of to dealers. Purdue settled all of its litigation for around $8 billion, and that forced the company to go out of business. But not really. I mean, if they go out of business, they can't pay. So they basically were restructured under a plan designed to funnel their profits into government programs. That's right, no victims are getting paid from the Purdue settlement, and chances are no victims will get paid from the Walmart settlement either. This isn't about paying victims, it's about funding massive government bureaucracy. It's about funding a war. I mentioned Purdue because they help establish a pattern, or more accurately, they reinscribe an old pattern, one as old as the war on drugs. Ever since Harry Anslinger, and even before him, if you look at the state level, the recipes worked like this. First comes the amplification of a few strategic lies, and the most important of these lies is a false distinction between drug dealers, whom we've been told deserve punishment, and drug users, whom we've been told deserve treatment.
If you break the law and illegally peddle these deadly poisons, we will find you, we will arrest you, and we will hold you accountable.
We intend to do what is necessary to end the drug menace and to eliminate this dark, evil enemy.
But if we don't get tough on the drug dealers, we're wasting our time. And that toughness includes the death penalty.
I have no sympathy for the pushers and the peddlers.
These people are killing our kids.
Without these separate categories, we'd have no one to punish, no one to hunt down and war against. But this distinction is often a false one, because all drug users are drug dealers in a culture of prohibition. I mean, we can't afford not to be. We share when someone's detoxing, and a lot of times we'll pool our cash together to get a better deal on a larger bag of dope. An ounce of heroin might cost $1,500 if it's purchased in one visit, or upwards of $5,000 if purchased slowly in small bags. But even if we could figure out who is buying in bulk to get a discount and who is buying purely to make a profit, we still don't have any reason to punish one of these groups and to treat the other, at least not without the constant messages that we all get from culture, messages that tell us dealers are evil, that they're immoral monsters. This episode is about Walmart, and it's a bit ironic that some of the only capitalists doing better than Walmart are drug dealers who can make 1,000% markup because their product, unlike Walmart's, is illegal to sell. If it wasn't, Walmart would probably put dealers out of business, and the government would be right back where we started, trying to figure out a way to make Walmart look bad for doing exactly what big business has to do to survive: cut the bottom line and keep customers coming back. So once you establish this false distinction between users and dealers, you can ramp up the war against the so-called dealers, then slowly reconfigure the category to sweep in as many people as possible. People like me, who only sold to pay for our own addictions. Or people like my friend Morgan Godvin, who was charged with murder when her friend overdosed on drugs she supplied for him. Or even entire organizations, like drug manufacturers and Walmart pharmacies, and sometimes even entire countries, like Harry Anslinger did with China 50 years ago.
According to all the documents that we have been examining, the major source is Red China.
And that's the second part of the recipe. Build an image of these so-called dealers that makes the public call for blood. And this imaginary character is easy to spot in our cultural artifacts, in our films, our TV shows, our books, and our newspapers. We see them everywhere in the narratives that we use to make sense of our lives.
Hey, kiddies, gather round. The man with the goodies is here.
It hasn't changed much, although it evolves just enough to keep up with the contemporary cultural norms, to scare us as much today as it did 50 years ago.
They said half a hit of E would be fun. They lied.
These fear-inducing stereotypes have provided plenty of fuel for the war on drugs, and it could rage on for another century so long as it only needed to remain the size that it currently is. But that's not how the war was designed. This war was designed to expand forever. The government's describing Walmart just like it described other drug dealers in the past, as dangerous villains interested only in profit, as dope-peddling vultures who prey on the weakness of their fellow man. As you might expect, this lawsuit does not say that the government's goal is to send users to the street or to ramp up the war on drugs. And presumably, many who support this suit, maybe even those who drafted it, do not see it the same way I do. So let me take a shot at explaining the alleged goals of this lawsuit from their perspective. Let me try to come all the way over to the anti-drug warrior camp and explain it in the most positive light possible. To begin with, most prosecutors have an honest-to-goodness belief that they're good guys, just like most cops, or most humans for that matter. They don't take credit for false convictions or long-term confinement of innocent people, like happened with Khalif Browder. He was locked up in Rikers Island for years before finally being released with the charges dropped, only to commit suicide a few months later. They usually ignore the systemic issues which they perpetuate and normalize, like happened with the so-called exonerated five from the Central Park jogger case Trump made famous when he paid for full-page ads in local newspapers calling for the return of the death penalty.
You better believe that I hate the people that took this girl and raped her brutally. And it's more than anger, it's hatred. And I want society to hate them.
When these men were later exonerated, the detectives who elicited the false confessions and the prosecutors who used them were asked what they did wrong. What happened? And they said they didn't do anything wrong. The war on drugs is no different. Despite the evidence that now makes clear how easy it would be to end the opioid epidemic by simply regulating drugs, politicians and prosecutors continue to blame the results of prohibition on the chemicals which they prohibit. There's some magic afoot when law enforcement can look north to our Canadian neighbors or across the ocean to countries like Portugal and Switzerland and find example after example of various decriminalization strategies which inevitably reduce crime, end overdose death, and put street dealers out of business. But we still stick to our deadly strategy of attacking dealers. Again, the goal of this conflict has never been harm reduction. So we're now at a point where the war on drugs is killing almost 80,000 people every year in the United States from overdose. But the generals and the sergeants in this war are encouraged to make believe that they aren't responsible for the death caused by their war. That leaves them free to concoct all sorts of interesting ways to generate revenue, all under the guise of fighting righteous battles against the scourge of intoxication, and all while ignoring the negative consequences of their actions. So speaking from that sort of bubbled, head-in-the-sand perspective which prosecutors are allowed to adopt, this lawsuit is meant to hold Walmart accountable for its role in dispensing drugs to people who may have been selling them for a huge profit, people who may have gotten other people addicted, and maybe even sold them drugs which they used to overdose. Blech. But that's what they really think. The Justice Department is alleging that Walmart knew people were filling large prescriptions for strong opioids which they intended to sell or use recreationally, and that corporate bigwigs ignored their ethical and legal responsibility to inform the police in favor of profits. Remember, this war on drugs isn't new. We're more than a century in, and we've never managed to eradicate or even substantially reduce either supply or demand. Products like OxyContin and fentanyls didn't exist until a couple decades back, so we can't blame them for the problems that predate them. But that seems to be one of the biggest arguments propping this lawsuit up. The idea that the overdose epidemic is simply the result of these drugs existing. And incredibly, that's not the biggest trick they're pulling with this lawsuit. The only reason the alleged pill mills would exist is because the war on drugs creates a massive underworld market for anyone willing to risk being charged with a crime. Heroin costs less than $3 a gram to produce, and fentanyls are becoming cheaper by the month, not to mention easier to manufacture. We can't stop the supply of drugs to the United States. It won't be long before you can 3D print them from the comfort of your own home. But for now, we can stop one thing. We can stop the supply of safe drugs, and by doing that, we can make sure pills, which cost a few pennies to produce, can be sold for tens or even hundreds of dollars on the streets. Then we can criminalize those who sell them to pay for rent, or to feed their kids, or to buy a nice car. It doesn't matter. They're all drug dealers in the eyes of the law. Each arrest forces the price of drugs higher and the purity yet lower. It's no secret that if we regulated drugs and sent users to doctors who could fearlessly treat them and give them safe drugs when they wanted them, nobody would run a pill mill. They wouldn't be able to because there wouldn't be any profit in it. But then, the expensive law enforcement departments wouldn't exist either. We wouldn't need them. But if you can keep filing lawsuits and arresting fresh blood, you can defend permanently expanding budgets and new drug enforcement units, which, in turn, will pack our prisons once again with so-called drug criminals who could be treated by doctors much cheaper than incarceration. Whew. Okay, tell us how you really feel, right? I don't hate law enforcement, but I do recognize that a ton of cops and other law-abiding citizens are going to lose their jobs the second we stop incarcerating drug dealers and boosting the market for would-be dealers. We won't need them anymore, and that's scary. That's a big part of the reason the war on drugs persists. But a reckoning is coming, one way or another, and the sooner we rededicate the energy currently spent on war to education and harm reduction, the sooner the so-called opioid epidemic will be over. Okay, now let's talk about Walmart. The reason they've kicked everyone's ass and become a massive international corporation is because they buy in bulk, like super bulk. This is capitalism 101 in a global economy, and that's why they're putting mom and pop shops out of business left and right. They purchase 1 million t-shirts and 1 million size large blue sweatpants, and they save a ton of money by doing it that way. But it only works if you can follow that recipe in every department. Electronics, guns, sporting goods, and, the focus of today's episode, the pharmacy. Walmart's goal with prescriptions was the same as their goal for everything else. They wanted to make picking up your drugs more convenient and less expensive than their competitors. Normally, in our capitalistic culture, we applaud this sort of competition, for better or for worse, as a measurement of success. Walmart's currently sitting on around $14 billion, so they've been pretty successful by almost any bar. Walmart's just giving us what we want, the same products as the next guy for a cheaper price. But in the United States, we've developed an appetite for demanding products that might not be in our best interest, then attacking companies who nail the recipe. From fake news to greasy french fries, success in capitalism means giving the customer what they want, and then bracing for pushback when they don't want to take responsibility for the consequences. We blame the hand that feeds us. That's what's happening with Walmart right now, along with the shameful fleecing by the Department of Justice. The war on drugs has been around way longer than Walmart, and it brings in far more revenue every year. In fact, it's so massive that it's hard to put an exact number on how much cash is really generated by the war. But we pay upwards of $100 billion every year just in taxes to keep it going, and it's designed to rake in as much as possible in confiscated goods and cash, which fund local police departments and special drug units. But the web is much larger than that, because that cash doesn't just sit in a vault somewhere, slowly paying salaries to hard-working police officers. That cash funds a massive complex of private corporations, drug test manufacturers, weapons and body armor distributors, training programs, halfway houses, parole officers and the subcontractors who keep their offices running, electronic monitoring equipment and programs. The list could go on. And it pays the salaries of a ton of officers who wouldn't be needed if the so-called criminals whom officers are robbing to fund their gang, law enforcement, weren't being prosecuted for selling illegal chemicals. It wouldn't be difficult to put every illegal drug dealer in this country out of business tomorrow and to reduce the number of overdose deaths by 90%. We could just legalize and regulate drugs, send people who want heroin or cocaine to doctors instead of street dealers, and label, test, and regulate the products, just like we do with other pharmaceuticals. But we won't consider it. Not because we actually have a moral issue with providing clean drugs to addicted people. I mean, that's part of it for your average Joe, sure. My grandma still believes that the existence of heroin clinics would result in masses of people giving up on life and becoming hopelessly addicted to heroin. But when I ask her whether or not she would go use heroin if it were legal, of course she says no, and neither would any of her friends, or their friends. She's been fed a lie her entire life, so I can't blame her. That lie says that drugs are illegal because they're horribly dangerous and deadly, because using them, sometimes just once, will result in debilitating addiction and a loss of morals. Of course, if I believed all those things, I wouldn't want heroin clinics either. And it used to be defensible to believe this lie. I used to believe it. Even after I stopped using heroin, I still thought it had so-called chemical hooks, which would embed in my brain and pull me back in to use more if I ever picked up in the future. And I used to believe that decriminalizing drugs would result in everyone using them, even though I, too, was a counterexample. I didn't care that drugs were illegal. I used them anyway. Most people think that methods of obtaining heroin and cocaine legally would result in people using them and becoming hopelessly addicted en masse, even though most of us are actually counterexamples. The bullshit we've been fed by the war on drugs has left us completely confused. But nowadays, there are examples all over the world of policies of decriminalization which tend to leave addicted people reducing or outright stopping on our own, without anyone threatening us or torturing us or putting us in a cage. We don't have to guess what would happen if we legalized drugs because it's already happened in other places across the world. And everywhere where it has happened has been rewarded with harm reduction on a national scale. The system we call the war on drugs is huge, and it's almost entirely composed of good guys. Police officers, sheriffs, SWAT units, rich business owners who donate to community efforts and employ thousands of hourly wage earners in their corporations. People who wouldn't have jobs if the war on drugs didn't exist. It goes all the way to the top. There are officers at the Department of Justice who wouldn't have anything to do if drugs weren't being used as an excuse to wage war against US citizens. And these good guys, usually plucked from the best of local and regional police departments, these cats aren't going to change their minds about drugs anytime soon. They stand to lose too much, and as the overdose deaths keep piling up, as this so-called opioid crisis, which is the result of the war and will never be solved by ramping it up, as it gets worse, the people in charge of fixing it get more desperate for scapegoats. If they ever run out of people to blame, they'll be forced to bear that blame themselves. So with all that in mind, let's go back to Walmart. This all started picking up steam in late 2016 in the Eastern District of Texas, where prosecutors showed up to a Walmart pharmacy with a warrant to search their records for evidence that a local doctor was running a pill mill. Throughout the next year, Texas would do this 5 more times, and in May of 2018, prosecutors showed their hand. They demanded a $250 million settlement from Walmart as acknowledgement of their part in the so-called opioid crisis. This wasn't the first time the feds had come after Walmart. In 2011, Walmart agreed to a memorandum of agreement after the DEA accused them of filling non-legitimate prescriptions. As part of that agreement, in which Walmart did not admit or deny wrongdoing, the company agreed to install national procedures to identify bad prescribers and prescriptions not written for legitimate medical purposes, and then to report them quickly to the DEA. Now that deal's come and gone, but the government hasn't exactly backed off. And Walmart seems to have been pretty cooperative throughout most of this investigation. Too cooperative according to some critics. They're letting the government go through their records, our records if you're a patient, and they've made clear their desire to play along with the war on drugs. But it hasn't mattered. The war needs fresh blood, and the idea of digging into the pockets of big business is just too tempting for Texas and for the feds to pass up. So in October of 2018, a group of prosecutors, loosely referred to as the Working Group, head to Washington, D.C., determined to get the Department of Justice to charge Walmart in criminal court. These state officials, led by a guy named Joe Brown, who was a Texas prosecutor, headed to the Drug Enforcement Administration headquarters to meet with the acting administrator. And they brought testimony from a handful of pharmacists who claimed to have asked the corporate office for permission to blacklist certain doctors, but they were told that they could not do that it might actually be illegal to do so. But when these pharmacists asked what they could do, corporate reminded them that they had full authority to deny prescriptions on a case-by-case basis. They just couldn't deny a doctor entirely. Let me break that down. If they take a look at the person whom the prescription is written for and think, this guy doesn't look like he needs these drugs, they can tell you to beat it. That's how things are right now, and that's already a pretty fucked up policy. But that wasn't enough. These pharmacists wanted the authority to deny doctors the right to practice medicine. They wanted to blackball some doctors based on a hunch. And when corporate said no, when their bosses at Walmart headquarters told them to do their jobs and fill prescriptions, they snitched. They took it to the police, who were, as always, desperate for a scapegoat. Of course, power always makes people want more of it, so I can't blame these pharmacists for being human. They somehow feel like they should be the gatekeepers of the drugs they dispense, and that their own opinion should guide who is allowed to take them and who is not. But it's already hard enough to get our drugs without having to deal with a suspicious and shaming pharmacist who's determined to send us to the street. We don't need more gatekeepers. We need better gatekeepers and better gates. By 2020, it became obvious that law enforcement was on a witch hunt, so Walmart filed a preemptive suit. They basically said, hey, we've been doing everything we're supposed to do, filling prescriptions written by legitimate doctors, but it seems like you're running out of witches to hunt and that you've been sniffing around our door. So if you fools are trying to enforce some ridiculous moral standard of dispensing drugs, can you please let us know so we can conform to it? The Justice Department responded with a lawsuit of its own. This current complaint is civil, not criminal, which means the burden of proof is lower and the penalty is money, not jail time for anyone. And that's become the norm for the war on drugs, because again, this is all about money, not protecting anyone. The Department of Justice has never cared about the health or safety of drug users. They have cared about making heroes out of police officers who behave and who want big promotions. And they aren't going to just give that power up. They usually believe that what they're doing is right. They didn't pass the laws that criminalize drugs and built a massive machine upon which they now rely to feed their families. They just played by the rules. They made the team. Rethinking drug policy means rethinking social norms, but it also means figuring out ways to keep these folks employed and fulfilled when the war on drugs goes away. There is some pushback at the state level and from individual patients who are just as pissed off as I am. A woman named Edith Fogg has already filed a class action lawsuit against CVS, Walgreens, and Costco for refusing to fill chronic pain medication for her.
Class action complaint. Edith says her CVS pharmacist in 2017 told her they would no longer fill her opioid prescription medicine. Edith and her attorney believe that
some states are also pushing back. This is Georgia Chairman of Health and Human Services Sharon Cooper speaking in February of 2020. She's introduced legislation to prevent Walmart and other pharmacies from doing this.
There are patients in our state that do have chronic pain or other acute pain, and they are entitled within the laws that we have passed to be able to order pain medication, Schedule IIs, for their patients. Walmart is the only one I know of so far, has taken it upon themselves to make a national rule that allows their pharmacists to turn away perfectly legal Georgia prescriptions ordered by our physicians to help patients that have true pain. This insinuates that Georgia, the letter on your desk, is not doing our job to fight the opioid crisis, and I resent that. But more than that, I resent patients who live in rural areas of our state where the only pharmacist within 35 or 40 miles is a Walmart, going to get a legal Georgia prescription filled, and because of a national policy are told that that's an illegal prescription or that they won't fill it. What does that do where in counties where we have one doctor? What does that put in the patient's mind? My doctor's writing illegal prescriptions?
Others are pushing back too. The president of the Texas Medical Board threatened cease and desist orders against Walmart and their pharmacies if they continued to refuse certain prescriptions. Idaho, Wisconsin, Iowa, and a growing list of other states have also pushed back hard against Walmart's attempt to comply with the federal government's evolving demands. And that's created this awkward situation for Walmart. I mean, they can't exactly say, screw y'all, we like giving people opioids, but they also can't just say, fuck it, we won't sell them anymore, because a lot of people are really pissed off about that too. There is no right answer in this debate, not in the midst of the war on drugs anyway. And it's episodes like this one that probably make clear why I chose to skip sponsorship. That's the reason you're not hearing a lot about this story. And what's fucked up is that Walmart has complied. They claim to have denied hundreds of thousands of opioid prescriptions, to have contacted the DEA tens of thousands of times with leads, and to have outright canceled thousands of doctors' ability to write prescription for any scheduled drug, including, by the way, buprenorphine, Suboxone, which is vital to addiction treatment and can lead to relapse and overdose if it's withdrawn. A lot is still going to happen with this case, and it's possible that Walmart will punt into the next administration by paying another big fine and agreeing to some new restrictions. But if we don't pay attention to how the war on drugs is working to ramp up yet again, we'll miss our chance to finally end this war and to institute policies of compassion and restoration. The war on drugs has been over for a long time. Drugs won. But until the warriors are given the all clear to stop waging it and killing people, we'll continue to see the casualties. Every 7 minutes, someone in the United States dies from a drug overdose. Someone else is arrested every 20 seconds. My home state, Colorado, is currently losing someone to an overdose every 6 hours. And it's all unnecessary. We can do better. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm your host, Ben Boyce.